Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Cole, and I work with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. Since 2018, the Canadian government has implemented a series of fisheries management measures aimed at reducing interactions between right whales and fishing gear. The largest of these measures are the extensive time area closure protocols that close areas to fishing wherever whales are seen. These closures largely impact the Gulf of St. Lawrence snow crab fishery, who have raised concerns about the cost these closures have on the industry. Meanwhile, ongoing entanglement events and mortalities in the Gulf have raised concerns about their conservation efficacy. As a result, the closure protocols have been amended each year despite not having quantitative estimates of their impacts. The project I will be discussing today aims to provide this first quantitative assessment in order to compare the effects of the different closure protocols. This is an ongoing and evolving project, so I'll focus primarily on our methods with some preliminary results. So since this project focuses almost exclusively on the annual closure protocols and how they compare, I'm going to briefly run through them to give some context. So the first protocol is from 2018, which was solely in effect for snow crab. This protocol is shown on the left and includes a large static exclusion zone in yellow and dynamic management areas in orange. The areas within the DMAs are subject to dynamic closures, which use an existing grid cell system, which you can see on that 2019 map. So a dynamic closure is triggered when a whale is sighted within one of these DMAs, and the grid cell it was sighted in, plus the 8 cells surrounding it, are closed for at least 15 days until a whale is no longer seen in that area. In terms of size, each individual cell is approximately 8 square nautical miles or 15 square kilometers. So one whale sighting could close approximately 2,000 square kilometers to fishing. So the second protocol from 2019, as you can see, had a smaller static area and an additional DMA. What was new this year was that these closures were applicable to other fixed gear fisheries, and a shallow water exemption protocol was added. So this protocol defines two areas, from the shoreline to a depth of 10 fathoms and from 10 to 20 fathoms, in which these portions of a cell would only close if a whale was sighted within those depths. And then the 2020 protocols are when we saw a bigger shift in the measures. The static and DMA zones were removed in favor of a Gulf-wide dynamic protocol, which was also extended into the Bay of Fundy and critical habitats. The dynamic protocol remained the same, but in the Gulf, if at any point a second sighting was observed in an actively closed cell, it triggered a season-long closure where the area around the second sighting would stay closed until November 15th, instead of that 15-day closure period. Additionally, this was the first year where acoustic detections could also trigger a closure. And finally, the 2021 measures remained unchanged from 2020, except the trigger for a season-long closure was changed to a second sighting only during days 9 to 15 of the closure period. So following these criteria of each of the four protocols, we used 2020 sightings from Whale Map to trigger hypothetical closures to compare the effects of each protocol. We only use sightings from April 28th to June 30th to trigger closures, since April 28th is when the closure protocols come into effect, and June 30th is the mandated end date of the fishing season for CFAs 12, 12E, and 12F snow crab, which are the fishing areas we are currently focusing on. So these maps just show the whale sightings for this period and a sample of the hypothetical grid cells that would be closed using the 2020 protocol criteria. So to quantify the impacts of the closure protocols, first we needed to determine a baseline estimate of fishing effort and entanglement risk without any closures. So for fishing, we averaged landings and traps hauled from logbooks for 2015 through 2017 to give the most recent reflection of pre-closure fishing activity. Using this, we estimated the probability of gear occurring in a grid cell, which was made relative across the fishing season, which pre-closure ran from April through July. And these maps show the probability of gear occurrence for May on the left and June on the right, with red being the highest probability. Next, to determine whale occurrence, we developed a novel method that, in place of effort, uses location uncertainty estimates from Johnson et al.'s 2020 paper. We developed this method over using a standard SPUE since the data remains sparse and it allows us to use all available sightings, including opportunistic. So for each sighting, we estimate the probability of the whale occurring in a grid cell at the initial sighting, 24 hours after the sighting, and 48 hours after the sighting. At that initial sighting, the probability of a whale's occurrence, so 100%, is entirely within the grid cell in which it was sighted. At 24 hours, this probability was evenly distributed across all cells within 50 kilometers of the initial sighting, and the same was done at 48 hours with all cells within 100 kilometers. After this, the distance was too great to effectively estimate occurrence. So we did this for all sightings in Canadian waters from 2015 through 2019, then averaged the results, which were made relative across the year, producing our final whale occurrence probability. And these maps showed the Gulf subset for May and June, where yellow is the areas where whale occurrence is most likely. So now that we have the probability of fishing gear and whales, we multiply the two values together to give our baseline estimate of entanglement risk, which was made relative to the fishing season. So we are assuming that the co-occurrence of fishing gear and whales is equal to the probability of entanglement. There were no whale sightings in April, so our period of overlap is from May through July. And again, these maps show May and June entanglement risk values, where yellow is the areas with the highest risk. Then finally, we use these different data layers to calculate the effects of the different closure protocols. So to determine impacts to the fishery, we calculated the monthly catch per unit effort by cell. The CPUE was used as a measurement of the value of a cell to represent the lost fishing opportunity resulting from the closures. The CPUE of each closed grid cell was summed for each day and expressed as a proportion of the annual snow crab CPUE, which was the catch that was unavailable to harvesters while the cell was closed. The same method was applied to determine the conservation benefit. So using our entanglement probabilities, we determined the monthly risk value of a cell, and we summed the total within the closed cells to determine the proportion of the total seasonal risk that was removed by the closures. So even though the closures were estimated daily, we applied an overall monthly CPUE and risk value to simplify our calculations. So now for some results. And again, these are just preliminary, but this graph shows the number of cells that were closed by the different protocols throughout the snow crab fishing season. The 2018 and 2019 protocols had a higher number of cells closed in May due to the static closures, whereas the others only had closures when a whale was sighted. The 2020 and 2021 protocols had an overall higher number of cells closed, and this was due to the removal of the DMAs so that any sighting in the Gulf could trigger a closure. It is important to note that even though there were more cells closed, not every cell is fished, so some of these closures may not have any impact on the fishery. So in terms of the impacts, this graph shows the progression of lost fishing opportunity throughout the season. These percentages represent the proportion of the total seasonal CPUE that was unavailable to fishing due to a closure. Again, we can see the impact of the static closures in early May, and an ANOVA showed that there was a difference in the cost among the protocols, but a post hoc test determined that the only difference was between 2018 and 2019. So the 2018 protocol resulted in more lost fishing value than the 2019 one, but otherwise there was no differences among the different protocols. So finally, this is the overall seasonal risk reduction. And I know that this graph looks a little bit different, and that's because May only contributes 8% of the overall seasonal risk, while June holds 81% of the risk, which means June is actually 10 times more dangerous than May. So we are seeing very similar patterns among the protocols, which another ANOVA found no significant differences. So all of the protocols are providing similar levels of entanglement protection. I do want to mention July, even though it's not on the graph. So pre-2018, this fishery would operate into July, but one of the measures that began in 2018 was that the fishery now ends on June 30th. And based on our risk estimates, July encompassed 11% of the overall risk from this fishery. So regardless of the closure protocols, we saw an immediate 11% risk reduction simply from ending the fishery a couple weeks earlier. So like I said at the beginning, this is an ongoing project, and the values I presented are preliminary and represent a theoretical maximum best case scenario where all the fishing that was in a closed area is removed from the fishery. We know that this isn't what happens and that fishing activity gets displaced elsewhere. So because of that, and some of the caveats I mentioned throughout this presentation, there are a few next steps to this analysis. And this includes incorporating a displacement factor to account for increased fishing effort outside the closed areas, as well as a factor for lost fishing gear that may remain in closed areas. We also haven't included the shallow water protocol, so we do plan on incorporating that for more detailed estimates within those shallow areas. We're also hoping to replicate this method with other years of whale sightings. These results are just using the 2020 sightings to trigger closures, and we want to see how the 2018 through 2021 distributions would change our results. And then finally, we will be incorporating other fisheries. So we're grateful to our funders through the Canada Nature Fund and Pew Charitable Trust that support this research. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I look forward to hearing your questions, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the consortium.